Hello and welcome to the Human Echoes recap for Better Call Saul Season 2, Episode 10. This one's called Klick with two K's and no C's. And we're here. It's the final episode of the season of Better Call Saul. Season 2 is closing out with this episode. And just get right into it. We open up with a teaser, little tiny bit of a bait and switch at the beginning because we're in the hospital, and I don't know about you guys, but I saw the little heart monitor. They shoot it so you see Jimmy first, and I'm thinking, okay, this is Jimmy in the hospital. But right after, it's not very long. They pull away. You see that Chuck is sitting there with them. You see that they've got that bleach bypass look going on, and this is a flashback to Jimmy and Chuck sitting there as their mother is dying, basically in bed. And it's interesting because Jimmy doesn't. You almost get in this scene. You really get in this scene why Chuck just does not like Jimmy. You get a lot of justification for maybe some of Chuck's hatred of Jimmy because Jimmy is there. Their mom is on her deathbed, and he doesn't really seem to care. He's kind of flippant about it. He's like, "Hey man, you want to go get a sandwich or something?" And Chuck's like, "No. Our mom is dying. I don't want to go get a sandwich. This is important." And Jimmy just bugs off. He runs off and he's like, "I'm going to get a sandwich. I'll bring you something." And leaves. And I don't think that this is maliciousness on Jimmy's part or even necessarily uncaringness, but he is really bad at showing that kind of care if it does exist in his life. And Chuck's there alone with his mom. Jimmy leaves. And his mom, wakes up for just a moment from her coma that she's in, or stupor or whatever, where they're not exactly clear on what her health problem was, but there's something wrong with her. She's in the hospital. She wakes up for just a moment, and she calls out for Jimmy. And Jimmy's not there. And Chuck's there, and he's like, "I'm here, Mom, I'm here." And she says, "Jimmy, Jimmy." And then she dies. And in that one moment, you get all of Chuck's issues with Jimmy because Chuck knows that Jimmy doesn't care, or at least he thinks that he doesn't care about anything that's important to Chuck. And Chuck has worked really hard to make something of himself, right? He's become a lawyer. He's incredibly successful as a person. And, he has all these great standards and everything. And yet, on his mother's deathbed, who is she calling out for? She's calling out for the crazy son, the prodigal son, the one who's not doing it the right way. And it's just this great little window into what drives Chuck, which is really important to understand exactly how much Chuck, hate might be a strong word. They walk that line so well because they are brothers, and I think they love each other like brothers, and I think they hate each other like brothers. I think that they have both of those, that there's that competition and that, sort of sibling rivalry that, that you'll see a lot, but there's also, they still care about each other as family, and it's this bizarre, complicated mix of character stuff going on with them. But really, you get in that instance the negative side. Chuck really doesn't care for Jimmy, and he doesn't care who knows it. And so we fast forward now to Chuck, as we saw in the end of the previous episode, falling, hitting his head. Jimmy standing there. He's watching. I thought for sure he would pop his phone and dial 911. I thought, he would do that, and maybe there would be some kind of paper trail back to him. But no. We see him run in there to the copy store, and you understand that he knows what he's doing, right? He's giving up his gambit here. If he runs in there, there's no way for him to explain why he was there, why he was watching Chuck to make sure things went the way he needed them to go, unless Chuck is right. So he runs in there to help Chuck. He gives up, he gives up himself. He knows that this is going to put him in, we find out, talk about from at the previous episode, and also sort of reminded in this episode, this is a felony that he's committed, altering these documents. and he's willing to do that for Chuck. He's willing to take at least the potential risk of being charged with a felony to go and help his brother. And he does. He goes in, and I realized once I was in the scene that thinking about just calling 911 wouldn't be enough, because Jimmy is at least partially dragged along with Chuck's delusion of being allergic to electricity. So he goes in there and he's turning off all the lights. He's pulling the power out of the copiers, and everybody's looking at him like, what's wrong with you? He's taking charge. He calls 911. And then we get a really great shot with Chuck where, they pull him into the hospital and you see him on the bed. It's like the camera's basically upside down. It's this weird angle where he's like at the top of the screen, and then the hospital and doctors and stuff are at the bottom of the screen, and you're rolling along. It's mounted to the bed with him. So you're rolling along with the bed with him through the hospital. It's a long shot. It's probably 2 minutes. I mean, we're not talking ultra long. We're not talking like a 6-minute, action scene. It's technically doesn't seem like it would have been that difficult to pull off, but from a performance standpoint, Michael McKean is nailing it, because you're seeing, you watch as the overhead lights are going overhead, and the Wi-Fi emitter and all of this stuff that's in his mind just emitting electricity. And then they put an EKG on him, and he's like, no, I don't consent to the EKG. No. Because he believes that the electricity is going to harm him. And, he gets through the emergency room. He deals with what he has to deal with. They put him in a bed with the lights off and the things turned off and everything just like he wants to be. And the doctor comes to Jimmy and says, you gotta do something here. And Jimmy's in a weird place, because he's bought into enough of Chuck's phobia is not the right word, his problem, right? Chuck believes that the electricity is going to harm him. And even though it's been proven that it won't, to Jimmy and probably to Chuck, let's be real, somebody has probably tried to pull the wool over his eyes or something. But even though it's been proven that it doesn't work, and Jimmy even tests it out with his watch. He carries his watch in his pocket, leaves it on, doesn't turn it off, and Chuck doesn't notice because it's not where he can see it. Even though that is all true, and Jimmy knows it on a sort of logical level, he still can't bring himself to fully believe that his brother is crazy. And that is just, it's such a fascinating area, because it puts him in, if he could fully buy into it, I think he would have a lot less problem doing what he does. But it's a real struggle for Jimmy. But he does. Ultimately, he gets a temporary guardianship where he can have control over what is going to happen to Chuck medically, but he doesn't have him committed. That Chuck is worried that Jimmy's going to take all his freedom and take his ability to make this medical decisions for himself. And Jimmy doesn't do that. He says, listen, let's go for a temporary emergency thing where I make the decisions. He gets the tests he needs, but then he can go back to his home. And you see here that Jimmy doesn't have it in for Chuck. Chuck keeps expecting something nefarious, something devious. And despite the fact that Jimmy has sort of fought with Chuck and even done things against Chuck, he doesn't want to see Chuck fail. And I think that's an interesting dichotomy, because Jimmy is all the stuff he does. We find out later, he talks to Chuck about, when he talks to Chuck about the papers and the things he changed, he says, I wasn't trying to screw you over. I thought that you would just move on. You would say, that's weird. I made a mistake. And then Kim would get the Mesa Verde papers and you wouldn't freak out. But no, apparently you can't be like a normal person. You have to have a complete nervous breakdown about making this one stupid mistake. And he says it, he's being kind of hostile in that scene, but he also, it really gives us a window into Jimmy's not trying to hurt Chuck. Jimmy didn't do that because he's like, I'm going to get back at my brother. He did it because he felt like Kim deserved that contract with Mesa Verde. And so he does the tests. He takes Chuck back home. And then we see that Chuck decides to retire. Jimmy gets a call at his new law practice, and he's he's there, with his new clients. He's doing elder law. We get to see the commercial that he was putting together, which is not, I'm going to say it's maybe not as big of a payoff as I would have liked for as much buildup as they did. I actually forgot to cover in my recap of a couple episodes ago when he was in the schoolyard with the flag and getting that shot. But you have several scenes where he's finagling his way around trying to get this video footage of these elder people, so that he can put together this clip. And then when you see it, it's sort of in a dark hospital on a little TV, and you look up and it's him, and then it switches to the not the lawn, whatever, the thing with the gardening tool doodad. And it's a little bit underwhelming. I wanted there to be a bigger payoff for that, kind of. I'm not mad. It's not like, man, that was terrible. But I would have liked to see just a little bit something more. But we don't get that. So, but we do see Jimmy. He's being successful, right? I don't know exactly how much time has passed, but somebody saw his ad. He's obviously a good salesman. He has customers in the office. He has the one guy who's old and took forever to tell him what his problem was, or, you just get the tail end of that where he's shuffling the guy out. Here's the door. Yes, you're looking great. Get them sunglasses on. And you can tell Jimmy McGill, as irritated as he might be with how slow this guy is, he's consummate professional. He's definitely going to, give him the smile and the, pat on the back, and not going to push him out the door any faster. He's good at what he's doing. And he's there, and he gets the call. Kim brings him, says, Howard's calling me over and over and over, says, you screwed something up. What's going on with Chuck? And the interesting thing about this episode is Kim is hardly in it, which is fine. She's had a lot of cool episodes where she was sort of the focus and had a big character arc. And arguably, it's the Jimmy and Mike show here. Mostly Jimmy, but I think we really, especially in how that Jimmy and Mike haven't interacted much this season. I think they had 1 or 2 scenes together in 10 episodes, which is fascinating to me that they're ballsy enough to do that kind of storytelling. But Kim is a very important part of the story too, and she's not much in this episode, but the moment that she is really in this episode is Jimmy asking her to get coffee for his customers. And Kim gives him a great look like, are you serious right now? Are you seriously asking me to be a receptionist? We're co-lawyers here. But she does it because she's his friend, and because she knows he's not intentionally being dismissive or anything. But I did like that she got that one little moment of just, you cannot be serious with me, asking me to get coffee for these people. But he gets the call from Howard Hamlin. Howard says, essentially, well, we don't find out in this scene, but Howard tells him Chuck is resigning the law. And Jimmy goes to Chuck and says, bangs on the door. Chuck does a great, speech about, he takes a while to let him in. And he says, I know why you're here. All right, whatever. And Jimmy walks in, Chuck unlocks the door. Jimmy walks into the room, and we get a great shot of what Chuck's working on. And Chuck is putting up all of this foil and like insulating material and stuff around this one room in his house. And he starts talking to Jimmy about how that the radio waves can come right through the walls of the house, and how could he be so silly? He needs to build a Faraday cage. And Jimmy's like, this is crazy. You can't do this, first of all, but if you're going to do this, don't quit. And he makes a really great argument, and he says something. He says, what are you if you're not a lawyer? And having seen the episode and knowing what Chuck's gambit is here, it's fascinating to me that this is how he plays it. That he knows that Jimmy is inherently a good person. Because if Jimmy was the scumbag that Chuck wants to believe that he is, he wouldn't admit to what he did. But Chuck tells him, I'm quitting because I made that mistake, right? Clearly I'm getting old, and, this electricity thing is messing me up. I just transposed these two numbers. It was, stupid clerical error. My brain is failing me. And having seen the episode, we know that he's baiting Jimmy into doing something, into admitting it. But the fact that he believes that Jimmy will admit to this is, I think, really telling. Because, or at least he feels very strongly that Jimmy will confess to this if he thinks that it will help his brother. And Jimmy does. And in watching this scene, you kind of knew it was coming. I was either this or he was just not going to accept what Jimmy said at all. Either he was fooling him or he was just going to just drop out of law entirely and he wouldn't accept Jimmy's not apology. Jimmy didn't apologize so much, but his explanation. He wouldn't believe Jimmy. And he acts as if he doesn't believe him at first. And Jimmy assures him like, no, it's like everything like you said, exactly like you said, it happened. And then we see that Chuck has a tape recorder going. And I am really torn about this little plot development here because I don't know what Chuck's endgame is here. I'm not a lawyer, okay? But I don't think that Jimmy, in this context especially, saying this stuff to Chuck, even on recording, is gonna be enough to convict him in a court of law. Chuck says to him, this is, you realize you're just admitted to a felony, and Jimmy's like, oh, whatever, it's he said, it's your word against mine. But more than that, the way that Jimmy admits to it, I think he could still really easily spin it as, hey, listen, he was delusional. He was losing it. I just said it to bring him out of it. I don't know for sure that he said enough to really 100% nail him to the wall in a court of law. But I'm not also sure if that's what Chuck's plan is or if Chuck wants to use it in a less, less conventional way. It's possible he could play it for some of Jimmy's clients. He could convince people that Jimmy's a bad guy, even if he can't prove it as a lawyer. And he can convince people that Jimmy did this because it's the words coming out of Jimmy's mouth. And I'm not sure that the writers know at this point. I mean, this is the end of season 2, so it's up in the air. But I was left with some questions about how valid that is. And if you have any thoughts on that, if you're watching the YouTube video, please feel free to leave a comment because I'm curious if anybody knows something more than I do about how much legal standing this tape has. Also, I haven't looked this up. I intended to, but I didn't. I don't know if Nevada is a single consent recording state, because some states you have to have the consent of both parties being recorded. Some states you only have to have the consent of one person. So basically, if I know that I'm recording and I'm okay with that, if one person on one end of the conversation records another person, that's okay. I don't know what the legality is of that, but it seems like that would also put Chuck on some shaky ground if he's going to bring this up in a court of law. The other plot in this episode, which as I have mentioned, has nothing to do with Jimmy, and basically Mike's whole thing has been sort of separate from Jimmy this whole season, but is Mike getting ready to do his full measures. We saw at the end of the last episode, he wasn't willing to mess around with leaving people alive anymore and negotiating and non-violence. He's been trying this whole season not to do that. And now he finally sees that he's not saving anybody. He's not helping anybody. He screwed this one guy, innocent tourist not tourist, but a good Samaritan who he'd never met. Some guy comes across and finds the guy tied up by the side of the road and gets killed for it. And so Mike decides, listen, if people are going to get killed, I'm going to do the killing and I'm going to decide who gets killed. And he goes and he gets a gun from the gun dealer from Breaking Bad and also earlier in the season. Great actor, great character, not a ton to say about him, but it is interesting to see him and Mike interact knowing that they have very similar backgrounds. Because Mike and, I want to say the guy's name is Jim, either the character or the actor. Mike and the gun guy both share sort of a past military experience. They're both very professional. They both take pride in criminal work, which is an interesting way of looking at it. They're both they're bad guy. They're criminals who aren't bad guys. Let's put it that way, that they have their own code and their own way of doing things, and have justified themselves to themselves in a certain way. And so it's neat to see them together. It's really a throwaway scene with Mike sighting that gun in, but it still works, and you see him getting ready. You see him prepping, and he goes up to Tio's. Well, we see first, we kind of get a little bit of a follow along shot with Nacho and the guy who was in the truck. They're taking him off to someplace, to some shack somewhere out in the middle of the desert, and Mike follows them and parks his car pretty far away. And it's a relatively simple scene of him, getting his scope set up. He's looking down the sights. Excuse me. He sees them come out with the guy, and he's still, I think, not 100% Rambo yet. He's still not the Mike that we know in Breaking Bad, but he's made the decision he's going to kill, but he's not willing to kill everybody, which he could do. He could kill all these guys, but I think in his mind he says, okay, I'm going to take off the head, I'm going to kill Tio, and everything's going to be okay. It's all going to be good. Just got to kill this one guy. But Nacho stands right in the way, which, just by coincidence. And there's a great shot of Mike like a kilometer away, which is supposed to be the distance that he's firing this round. Just doing this, like, get out of the way. Come on, move, man. And he could take the shot, right? Possibly he might, miss if the bullet went through Nacho's head. Maybe there'd be some tumbling if it didn't hit Tio. But really, I think he just doesn't want to shoot Nacho. And here again, we have him. It's interesting how that they're pacing out this character development. They know that they can't get to the end really, really quickly. They know where they have to go, and they've sort of spaced out how long they have to get there. So we have Mike becoming a little bit more willing to kill, but not completely trigger happy and just, I'll take out whatever goons if it serves my purpose. And he's sitting there with the rifle. He's sitting there, they're looking down the scope, wishing for, Nacho to get out of the way, and he just does not do it. They move back. It's a really well coordinated shot that looks accidental, but it's just perfectly in Mike's way. And then he hears a car horn going off, and he's looking down the scope, and he sees the guys starting to bury the one dude who they'd shot, and they're not reacting. And it takes Mike a minute to realize, oh, that's my car horn. And he goes back to the car, sort of pulls his revolver, sneaks up on it. There's a tree branch rested like between the seat and the horn, pushing the horn down, and a note in the windshield that just says, "Don't." And obviously it's not one of Tio's guys, because they would have just capped Mike if they knew he was there. Which leads me to believe, knowing what I know about Mike, that we are about to get the chicken man. Los Pollos Hermanos. Hector, I think? No, not Hector. Dagnabbit. I'm dumb. You know who I'm talking about, though. Giancarlo Esposito, I feel very strongly, is coming back in the next season. Could be wrong. They could be pulling a bait and switch. I'm not, gonna bet $1 million on that or anything, but if that's what I want to see, that's what I think makes the most sense. And we're gonna see him and Mike team up, right? We're gonna see, because he's who's Mike is working for in Breaking Bad. He has to come into the story eventually. We haven't seen any of those chicken restaurants in Better Call Saul yet, at least that I've noticed, which is interesting. They've kind of kept that out of our minds for 2 seasons, but that guy's out there in this world. He's moving and shaking. He's not up to where he wants to be yet, but he is trying to take out these other people. And I believe, is Tio at that pool party where he poisons everybody in Breaking Bad? So that could be coming up in this scene for his future. it's just, it just has all of his flavor where he's like, I like this guy. He sees Mike. He knows what Mike can do. He sees what Mike's about to do. He wants Mike on his side, and he just needs him not to mess up his plan. So he distracts him. He puts the note in there. He's like, I'm gonna be in the shadows for now, but I'll be hiring this guy and taking out T.O. in the future, and I'll probably pitch that to him. That's just where my mind is going. It seems like it makes the most sense. Could be something completely different. I don't know, but man, am I pumped. We gotta wait a whole nother year and however long for another season of this stuff. Vince Gilligan and writers, get your butts moving, okay? You need to make this happen. You need to make it happen fast. I don't care about your dumb, slow writer's room. No, I do care. This is what makes this show important. But it really is impressive. And it's exciting when I hear Vince say things like, we don't know where the show is going. We don't have everything planned out. I think people like to have that, but it means that they're in their writer's room having the same conversations that we're having sort of along with us. When we're speculating what's going to happen next, what can happen next, what makes the most sense, what fits in with these characters. They've had those discussions episode by episode by episode, and they didn't have some grand end plan except to eventually get to Breaking Bad. But that's sort of a wider scope. Man, this show is not letting us down. It has not had a weak episode all season long. This certainly wasn't it. Ending on that, reveal that Chuck had the tape player going, and I will come back to that just a minute to say that it really shows you how bad Chuck wants to take Jimmy down, because he hates electricity. Like, that's pain to him. That's poison to him. He's got that electricity, that tape player going with batteries and an electric motor, and he's willing to play that off and put on the veneer of acting like he's okay in front of Jimmy. It just amazes me the lengths that he's willing to go to take Jimmy down. And even, I think he loves him. I think he loves him as a brother, but man, does he also loathe him. And that's so split between him, and he doesn't know what he wants to make of himself. And the sad thing is, he's alone. He's alienated so many people. I didn't mention, and it was a very important scene, and I wanted to bring up also the scene with the guy from the mailroom, the black dude who's helping him out. He stands up for Jimmy. Chuck is like, why were you there? I know you were there because you were watching me, because you came and bribed the guy. And we couldn't have had that scene at the end without having that moment where Chuck, looks Jimmy dead in the eye, and then the mailroom guy saying, actually, I called him. And making up a story to fill in for Jimmy, because Chuck doesn't get people. All right? He doesn't treat them like people. He certainly doesn't treat this guy as a person. This guy sees Jimmy as a friend just because they work together, just because he knows that he's a good guy, even if he's not a good guy. And so to have him cover for him in that moment, to take the risk, but also to see that he wants Chuck and Jimmy to work their issues out, that he's nervous about the fact that these guys are fighting. He doesn't want to see him fighting. He thinks that maybe by telling this lie, it'll, put some peace back together for this family. There's just so many great moving pieces. And to think that you can go into depth with even a character as small as that with this show really shows you how much care and effort they're putting into this. It's a whole year and however long to wait for the next season. But man, am I pumped for it. Can't come soon enough. So I will be there. I will be there with you guys watching Better Call Saul Season 3. And yeah, let's just wait and see what happens. Thanks for watching. Until next season, I'm Albert Berg for the Human Echoes Recap, and we'll see you later.